It was supposed to be a routine flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles, a mundane Tuesday morning on January 15, 2025. Passengers boarded, stowed their luggage and settled in for the cross-country journey. But what unfolded aboard Flight 837 would leave everyone on board questioning their assumptions and values. A simple accusation, a shocking confrontation, and one unforgettable moment would change everything. Before we dive into this powerful story of justice and redemption, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Here at Just Dark, we bring you gripping, thought-provoking stories that challenge societal norms and inspire change. The story begins just after 9 a.m. Passengers were still shuffling down the aisles, adjusting their belongings in the overhead bins, and settling into their seats. The air buzzed with the typical pre-flight chaos, flight attendants guiding passengers, luggage bumping against armrests, and overhead announcements crackling through the intercom. Among the travelers that day was Aisha Matthews, seated near the front in row 6. Dressed in a crisp navy blazer and holding a book, she looked like any other professional preparing for a business trip. But Aisha was no ordinary passenger. Beneath her composed demeanor was a woman with years of experience in handling crises. As a customer service quality control supervisor for the airline, Aisha's job was to ensure the very systems keeping passengers safe and satisfied ran smoothly. Yet today she would find herself in the center of a storm no manual could have prepared her for. The trouble started just minutes before takeoff. Linda Hart, a middle-aged woman sitting 2 rows behind Aisha, suddenly exclaimed that her wallet was missing. Panic flashed across her face as she patted down her seat and rummaged through her bag. A few passengers turned to look, but most remained preoccupied with their own routines. Then her voice cut through the cabin. That woman took it. She was pointing directly at Aisha. What began as a simple accusation would soon spiral into a public confrontation, one that would test the limits of fairness, justice, and the power of words. It was just another routine flight for most passengers on January 15, 2025. Flight 837 from Atlanta to Los Angeles was nearly full, with travelers from all walks of life settling in for the 4-hour journey. The aisles were alive with the usual bustle, overhead compartments being filled, seatbelts clicking into place, and the hum of pre-flight chatter creating a soothing white noise. Among the passengers was Aisha Matthews, seated in row 6 by the window. She was the picture of calm, dressed in a navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, a gold watch gleaming subtly on her wrist. Aisha had already tucked her carry-on neatly beneath the seat in front of her and opened a well-worn paperback. She was poised and focused, occasionally glancing out of the window as the ground crew completed their final checks. To anyone watching, she was just another professional making her way to her next destination. But just a few rows behind her, in row 8, Linda Hart was anything but calm. Linda, a middle-aged woman with short, curled hair and a bright floral scarf, had returned from the restroom only to discover her wallet missing. Her initial confusion quickly turned to alarm as she stood in the aisle, patting down the pockets of her coat and rummaging through her bag with increasing desperation. "My wallet, it's gone?" Linda's voice broke through the cabin noise, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. She checked her purse again, flipping through its contents, but it was empty. Her breathing quickened and her face flushed with panic. Passengers in adjacent rows leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. Some exchanged puzzled looks, while others murmured quietly, their eyes darting toward Linda. Her frustration soon boiled over into suspicion. Linda's gaze darted around the cabin, her lips pressing into a thin line as she mentally retraced her steps. Then, with a sudden intake of breath, her eyes landed on Aisha. "That woman?" Linda shouted, her voice trembling with both fear and fury. Her outstretched finger pointed directly at Aisha, who was still engrossed in her book. The accusation sliced through the cabin like a knife, halting the hum of conversation. Heads turned in unison toward Aisha, who looked up from her book, her brow furrowing slightly. For a moment there was only silence. "Excuse me?" Aisha's voice was calm, measured, but tinged with confusion. She closed her book, resting it on her lap. "You?" Linda pressed on, her tone growing sharper. "You were standing near my seat earlier. I saw you. You must have taken my wallet." Gasps rippled through the nearby rows. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. "What's going on?" one murmured to another. "Did she really take it?" The flight attendants sprang into action, sensing the brewing storm. A young attendant named Michael, his uniform crisp and his expression professionally neutral, approached Linda with his palms raised. "Ma'am, let's not jump to conclusions. Michael said gently, his voice steady. It's possible your wallet was misplaced. We'll help you look for it. But Linda was having none of it. She shook her head, her voice growing louder. No. I know what I saw. She's the one who took it. All eyes were on Aisha now, and the scrutiny was palpable. Yet she remained composed, her posture unwavering. She placed her hands on the armrests, meeting Linda's accusing glare with calm resolve. I haven't touched your belongings, Aisha said firmly, her voice clear enough for those around her to hear. Let's resolve this calmly. There's no need to create unnecessary chaos. But calm was no longer an option. The accusations hung heavy in the air, and the whispers grew louder, feeding the tension. Doubts began to spread like wildfire through the cabin. Michael exchanged a glance with his colleague, unsure how to proceed. He hesitated, then made the call. We're going to contact security, he announced, his tone carrying authority. He turned toward the intercom, leaving the passengers to absorb his words. The murmurs stopped. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as passengers braced for what was to come. Aisha sat quietly, her calm demeanor unshaken, while Linda crossed her arms, still glaring. The tension was palpable, electrifying the air. And in that moment it was clear, this was no longer just a missing wallet. It was a confrontation that no one on board would soon forget. The cabin settled into a tense silence after the flight attendant's announcement. A few moments later, Officer Daniel Clark appeared at the door of the plane. His uniform was sharp, his posture straight, but there was an unmistakable unease in his eyes. He was a young officer, probably in his late 20s, still learning the ropes of managing high-stakes situations. As he made his way down the narrow aisle, the cabin seemed to shrink. Passengers craned their necks to watch, their whispers barely audible but thick with anticipation. The hum of the engines seemed louder, filling the silence left by their collective tension. Officer Clark stopped in front of Linda Hart, who wasted no time in pointing out the supposed culprit. "Officer, it's her?" Linda exclaimed, her hand trembling as she gestured toward Aisha. Her voice was sharp and accusatory, rising in pitch with every word. "She was near my seat before my wallet disappeared. I know she took it." All eyes turned to Aisha, who remained seated. She was calm, composed, and unshaken despite the weight of the accusation. Her dark brown eyes met Officer Clark's, and without hesitation she spoke first. "Good morning, officer," Aisha said, her tone steady and measured. "I can assure you I've done nothing wrong. I'd appreciate it if we could handle this matter with fairness and professionalism." Her calm demeanor only seemed to inflame Linda further. "Fairness?" Linda spat, incredulous. "You stole my wallet. I demand you do something about it." Officer Clark raised a hand, signaling for quiet. He turned to Michael, the flight attendant, whose nerves were written all over his face. "We didn't see what happened," Michael admitted, his voice cautious. "But we've searched nearby and we haven't found the wallet yet." Officer Clark turned back to Aisha. His expression was conflicted, torn between procedure and the pressure of the situation. He finally spoke, his tone attempting to be firm but faltering just slightly. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning. We just need to clear things up." Aisha closed her book deliberately, placing it neatly on her seat as she rose. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the engines. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she addressed the officer. "Officer," she said, her voice calm yet commanding, carrying just enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Before you proceed, there's something you should know. I am Aisha Matthews, the Customer Service Quality Control Supervisor for this airline. My role is to oversee incidents like this and ensure fairness and justice for passengers and crew alike. I suggest you confirm the facts before taking this any further." The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Passengers exchanged stunned looks, their eyes darting between Aisha and the officer. Even Officer Clark appeared momentarily taken aback. His professional demeanor faltered for a split second before he composed himself again. Michael, the flight attendant, froze mid-step, his face a mixture of shock and realization. "One moment," he muttered, fumbling with his phone and quickly stepping away to confirm Aisha's credentials. Linda's bravado began to waver. Her pointed fingers slowly lowered, and her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Finally she stammered, What did you say you were?" Aisha didn't answer her. Her silence was intentional, a quiet statement of her confidence. Moments later, Michael returned, his face pale but resolute. "She's telling the truth," Michael said, his voice clear as he addressed Officer Clark. "She's corporate." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Passengers murmured among themselves, the tide of opinion shifting visibly. Officer Clark cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable now. He glanced at Linda, then back at Aisha, struggling to find the right words. But before he could speak, Linda's voice cut through the air again, sharp and defiant. "I don't care who she is," Linda shouted, her tone frantic. "She was near my seat. She had to have taken it." This time, her words carried less conviction. The once sympathetic glances she'd garnered had now turned skeptical. The tension in the cabin was reaching its peak when another flight attendant stepped forward. She carried a small flashlight and began a methodical search of Linda's seat and the surrounding area, carefully checking every crevice and corner. The passengers watched in silence, their eyes glued to the attendant's movements. The minutes felt like hours, the cabin heavy with anticipation. Then finally the silence was broken. "Found it," the attendant announced, holding up a black leather wallet. The relief in her voice was unmistakable. All eyes turned to Linda as the flight attendant explained further. It was wedged between the seat cushions the entire time. The cabin erupted into murmurs again, this time tinged with a mix of disbelief, embarrassment, and quiet vindication for Aisha. Linda's face flushed red as she stumbled over her words, unable to form a coherent apology. The flight attendant's announcement was met with stunned silence. All eyes turned to Linda as she stared at her wallet, now in the attendant's hand. Her face turned crimson and her voice, which had been so loud moments ago, was barely a whisper. I didn't see it there," Linda stammered. I'm sorry." The murmurs began again, but this time they carried a different tone. Passengers exchanged looks of disbelief and quiet judgment, their earlier suspicion of Aisha now replaced with sympathy, and in some cases shame. Officer Clark exhaled deeply, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders. He turned to Aisha, his face a mixture of guilt and embarrassment. "Miss Matthews," he began, his voice quiet but firm, "I deeply apologize. I shouldn't have acted without proper evidence. It was wrong of me to make assumptions." Aisha stood tall, her calm composure unshaken despite the ordeal. She gave him a small nod but didn't immediately respond. Instead, she turned to face the cabin, addressing the passengers who had all been witnesses to the scene. "Ladies and gentlemen," Aisha began, her voice steady and commanding, "today, we saw how easily assumptions can lead to injustice. Fairness requires us to look beyond our biases and seek the truth before acting. Mistakes happen, but how we learn from them is what defines us." The passengers sat in silence, her words sinking in. Some nodded, others looked down at their laps, and a few whispered apologies to one another. Even Linda, still clutching her wallet, managed to mumble a soft, "I'm sorry." The officer stepped aside and Aisha returned to her seat. The once tense atmosphere in the cabin now carried a heavy air of reflection. The flight attendants quickly resumed their duties, and the plane prepared for takeoff. As the engines roared to life, passengers stole glances at Aisha, their expressions a mix of admiration and regret. The rest of the flight continued without incident, but the events of that morning lingered in the minds of everyone aboard Flight 837. Aisha's grace under pressure, her refusal to let assumptions define her, and her powerful words left a lasting impact. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Aisha glanced out of the window, the city's skyline glowing against the setting sun. A quiet thought crossed her mind, a reminder she often carried with her. Justice is not about power or position, it's about truth, courage, and integrity. By the time the plane touched down, passengers departed with more than just their luggage. They carried with them a lesson, a reminder of the power of fairness, the weight of assumptions, and the courage it takes to stand up for the truth. Stories like this remind us of the importance of empathy, fairness, and reflection in our daily lives. If this story moved you, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join us at Just Dark as we continue to unveil powerful stories that challenge the status quo and inspire change. Together, we can spark meaningful conversations and create a more understanding world.